Scholastic Audio presents Infinity Ring, Book 7, The Iron Empire, by James Dashner. Read by Dion Graham. Prologue. Aristotle studied the black and white stones on the checkered Peña board, wondering if it was a bad idea to beat Plato 3 times in a row. The man might be the greatest philosopher of all time, but he sure got cranky when he lost at games, and a grumpy Plato was never a good thing. Trying his best to show a look of deep concentration, Aristotle moved a black stone to a square that opened up an opportunity for his teacher to trap him several turns later. "Going to let me win, are you?" Plato asked, a stern look of disapproval crinkling his ancient face, half hidden by a ringlet-filled beard. He leaned back in his chair, stroking that grand bushel of hair hanging from his chin. "Perhaps it's time for the teacher to become the student, and the student the teacher, when the student must teach the teacher what the teacher ought teach the student." Aristotle stared at his master, fighting to keep emotion from his face, fighting the smile that tried to force its way past the whiskers of his own beard. Plato sounded like a philosopher even when he complained about a board game. Several seconds later, after what seemed like a much longer battle of locking eyes, the two men burst into a fit of laughter that would shock anyone else at the Stoic Academy of Plato in Athens, Greece. But after 20 years, they had become much more than a pupil and his instructor. They were friends for life. "I thought I'd at least give you a chance today," Aristotle said. "A win for you might save a pupil or 3 from being sent to the kitchens to scrub pots." "Ah," Plato responded. "But it's there that you make your mistake in the line of logic, my dear student. You should have foreseen that I would spot your plan, which stabs my pride even more than a loss, thereby making for an irascible teacher indeed. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation." Aristotle frowned, slightly hurt. "Are you saying that you think less of me, master?" "Of course not." Plato stood, smoothing out the wrinkles in his tunic. "I'm only reminding you to be wary when you make decisions against an opponent in Peña. Wars have turned on less important matters. Come, let us drink wine and observe the setting of the sun." "What about—" Aristotle eyed the board. "You've tainted the challenge," Plato said, "and learned your lesson. Now come." They made their way to a balcony on the west side of the academy, its view a breathtaking glimpse of Athens and the sea beyond. The sinking sun painted a splash of orange across the thin clouds in the sky, and a salt-tinged breeze washed across Aristotle. He closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying the taste of life, then sat with his teacher, facing the waning day. "I want to hear your thoughts on the future," Plato said as he took a sip of diluted wine. "We spend so much time in these halls and courtyards speaking of the past, analyzing the present. But lately my mind has been heavy with contemplating that which has yet to come. The world is experiencing an explosion of knowledge and growth. But what path does it follow? Is the destination one to be desired?" Aristotle took his own long gulp of the sweet wine. This seemed a deep subject, even for his teacher, the master of deep subjects. It would be long into the night before this conversation ended. "Have I stumped you?" Plato prodded. "No, teacher. I'm only pausing to gather my thoughts before I say something foolish. It is the mark of an educated man to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." "Wise words," Plato responded. "Which is why, in my company, you can speak as you think, because I will never hold you to your musings. We are here to philosophize, and by accident we may change the very future of which we ponder. Or likewise we may spew forth nonsense and go to bed frustrated at the effort. As my teacher, Socrates, said before, I am the wisest man alive, For I know one thing, and that is that I know nothing." Plato grew silent, and Aristotle knew that the man now expected his student to start spilling his thoughts, which he did, finally feeling free to share the peculiar musings he'd pondered many times in the quiet of his room. "I often wonder if the world is part of a fabric, Master. Metaphorically, of course. We do, after all, imagine the fates as great weavers. Perhaps time is woven in a pattern, then, and there are threads of events placed in that pattern in some predetermined sequence. And if there is a design to the reality of the universe, does it follow that it's possible for that reality to be broken? For things to go the way they should not?" Plato had turned in his chair to look at his pupil, a sense of wonder in his eyes. "Please, do go on. You've captured my attention." Aristotle knew his teacher was sincere, and he continued with excitement. "As I study the tomes of our history, a recurring thought always comes to my mind. What if something happened that wasn't supposed to happen? Or what if something didn't happen that should have? Is it permanent? Is history permanent? Or can we change it?" "Change history?" Plato asked. "So much said in so few words. I think you've breasted a topic that, in truth, frightens me, my pupil. Not in a bad way, mind you, but my foundation trembles. No great mind has ever existed without a touch of madness," Aristotle said, "and I do believe that the things I've pondered about our past and future walk the edge of that madness. But by the same token, it may be the most important notion I've ever had." Plato nodded slowly, considering. "What is at the crux of this notion?" "Progress," Aristotle replied. "Technology, on a scale that is beyond even the furthest reaches of our understanding. What if someday our race advances enough that we could actually manipulate time and—" A rapid flurry of knocks at the door interrupted his words. Plato, his beard seeming a shade darker somehow, reluctantly ordered whomever it was to step onto the balcony. A young boy, his name was Python of Innis, popped his head in and apologized. "I'm sorry, Master," Python said, "but there is a message from King Philip, sent by horse. I thought you would want to see it." Plato sighed. "What would Socrates say at a time like this?" "Be kind," Aristotle provided. "For everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Don't put up airs, pupil." But Plato had the scantest glint of mirth in his eyes, a rarity these days. "Bring it, boy, and then get back to your studies. Tomorrow we will begin the theory of forms." Python quickly handed over the small scroll to his master, then scurried back inside from the balcony, shutting the door behind him. Plato unrolled the parchment and read through its contents, his expression never changing. Aristotle knew better than to pry. Finally, the scholarch of the Academy of Plato, and its namesake, looked up, eyeing his student. "Looks like our discussion on the madness of the mind and the ability to change history will have to wait until a later time, my friend." "Oh?" Aristotle hoped it wasn't bad news. Plato stood, then glanced at the scroll as he spoke. "You've been summoned by Philip to tutor his son Alexander III, the future king of Macedonia." Plato looked up once more, a sense of pride behind that beard and those ancient eyes. Aristotle swallowed, not sure what to think of such a life change. Alexander III? He's still a boy, still teachable. This might be a wonderful thing. Yes, indeed. Plato leaned on the railing and watched the dying glow of the sunset. There are those who say the boy is destined to have greatness. It is my sincere hope that you can make sure this is so. Yes, teacher, Aristotle replied, excited by the prospect. I will do my best. Chapter 1. The Horse's Eyes. This is the only thing I've ever put my foot down about, Dak said, folding his arms and trying his all-around best to look like a dude who meant what he said and said what he meant. We're already here, no changing your minds. He faced his best friend, Sera Frost, and his slowly but surely becoming second best friend, Rick Jones. They stood in a dusty, dry alley behind Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The year was 1865, the day, April 15th, just a few hours from what Dak now considered the darkest moment in all of history, because his hero of heroes was about to be shot in the head. He had read all about it in a history book he'd pilfered from 1945. Dak knew Abraham Lincoln as a congressman and lawyer who had spoken out against slavery and been silenced by the SQ as a result. But when the time travelers had fixed a break in 1850, they had, in a roundabout way, ensured that the great man would go on to do great things. Dak read all about them, and he couldn't bear the thought of what came next. Have you not learned a thing since we started all this? Rick asked him. The older boy wasn't being a jerk. Even Dak had to admit that the concerns over his plan were pretty valid. But this was Abraham Lincoln. President Abraham Lincoln. A once-in-a-lifetime chance lay before them. Sera had been nodding since the first word popped out of Rick's mouth. He's right, Dak. You mean a lot to me, and I know this means a lot to you. That's why I let you talk me into coming here. But now, we just can't do this. We can't. I'm sorry. Yes, we can. It took all of Dak's effort to stay still, resolute. He wanted to save President Lincoln, and that was that. And risk everything? Sera countered. Throw everything off balance? Create a new great break? Dak boiled inside. How can stopping the murder of our greatest president be a break? It'll only help the world get better. It's not about what events are good or bad, Rick said, and you know it. It's about a pattern, and that pattern being broken, making reality unstable. The historians didn't say that Lincoln dying was a break. Therefore, him not dying might very well be a break. It could unravel everything, Sera added. Dak sighed. They just saved the Louvre in France from being sabotaged by Marie Antoinette. Surely Abraham Lincoln was just as important as a dusty old museum. So, it's 2 against 1? He asked timidly, all his bravado gone. He heard horses clomping out on the main street, and it made him picture the president coming along in his own carriage soon. 2 against 1, Sera agreed. Good thing we're an odd number so we can't get tied up on decisions. Right? Right, Dak repeated. Then he turned and ran, sprinting down a connecting alley toward the sounds of the horses. Forget democracy this time. He'd talk to Lincoln if it was the last thing he ever did. Sera shouted his name from behind, and the sound of their footsteps followed. Dak knew he couldn't outrun them, so he had to get a little reckless. He burst out into the main street, where throngs of people and horses and carriages and carts were all in motion. Shouts and curses rang out as he bumped and jostled his way across the road, almost getting clomped by a big black horse whose eyes seemed to say, "Hey, idiot, quit messing with history." Dak swung around the other side of the horse and rider and scooted his way down the wooden sidewalk, running past shops and tanneries, a post office. He saw a break in the crowd and sprinted back across the street toward the entrance of Ford's Theater, where the nasty deed was going to go down in a few hours. He went for the door, hoping it was open, not caring who was behind it. No one played hide-and-seek like Dak, the ghost Smith. The door opened beautifully. 1 minute later, Dak was nestled behind a curtain in the back of the theater, sucking in breaths like a hungry hippo. After an hour of searching, Sera gave up. "What a goon," Rick said, leaning back against the wooden siding of a cooper shop. "It annoys the heck out of me that I've actually started to like that doofus." "No one says doofus anymore," Sera answered absently. "In 1865? Actually, they haven't started saying it yet. Not until around 1960. Rick smiled. But it's a good word. We should say doofus more often, especially when talking about Dak. Sera sighed, almost felt tears emerge. Come on, Dak, she thought. Please, please don't mess everything up. A beautiful two-horse carriage made its way down the street toward them, and people along the wooden walkways on both sides of the street were pointing and gawking, whispering to one another furiously. Sera knew who was inside even before the horses stopped right in front of the entrance to Ford's theater. Despite everything, she stared in wonder as the man Dak had described so reverently, beard, top hat, lankiness and all, stepped out of the carriage. Abraham Lincoln had arrived. Chapter 2. A Visit with Abe. Once Dak had known he was safe from Rick and Sera, he'd slowly and stealthily made his way through the rows of seats, out a door, up a flight of stairs, and onto the balcony where he knew President Lincoln and his wife would be seated. They should be there any minute now. He heard the voice before he saw the man. Dak had assumed the greatest leader the world had ever known would have a deep, resounding, booming voice, a voice that could be heard across the entire country every time he so much as said, "Excuse me." But that wasn't true. Lincoln actually spoke with a somewhat high-pitched, squeaky sound. Dak decided that just made him all the more likable. "Our seats are right up here, Mary," the man said. "The good people here at Ford's were so nice to arrange this. A great way to celebrate the Confederacy's surrender, don't you think?" "Why, yes, my dear. So very nice of them." Dak could hardly contain himself. He wanted nothing more at that moment than to give First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln a big hug. When the couple reached the little alcove, Dak gathered his courage and stepped out from the shadows. When he did, Mary gave out a little shriek and clutched her husband's arm. As for Mr. Lincoln, he grabbed her almost as hard, making a sound that made Dak picture a poor little mouse smashed by a boot. He couldn't really blame them for the reaction, seeing a geeky kid in strange clothes appearing out of nowhere. Dak held up his hands, palms out. "Hi there. Don't worry, I'm not here to assassinate you or anything. I'm from the future. Mary, you're looking quite dandy tonight." He let out a little peep of a laugh, and then his face reddened like coals as he realized that he'd just said about the dumbest assembly of words ever uttered by a human being. The president had regained his composure, however, his face a mask of calm. "Son, is there something I can do for you? My wife and I are here to enjoy the show tonight." "Yeah, about that," Dak began, searching for how to say this. He'd gone over it, over and over in his mind while he hid, but now it was all a blank. "Look, I only need a minute. I know this sounds crazy town, but I really am from the future, and I know something that you need to know. There's a man named John Wilkes—" "Stop!" Abraham Lincoln only said the one word, but it held so much power that Dak couldn't have spoken again for $1 million. Then the man came forward and knelt before Dak. Quite the feat, long arms and legs folding up like a wooden laundry rack, putting president and boy on the same level. Then Lincoln reached out and took Dak by the shoulders. "Listen to me, son," he said. "I can tell you're a good soul, and I'm sure that somewhere you have very proud parents. If you say that you're from the future, then I believe you. But if that's true, then there's a lesson I want you to learn. A lesson about destiny. My path has been laid before me, as has yours. Now it's our job to walk it." "But," Dak started, but the look on Lincoln's face stopped him cold again. The president smiled. "What's your name?" "Dak." "Dak? Unusual. But I like it." Lincoln stood up, unfolding himself until he seemed to stand 100 feet tall. Then, looking down at Dak, he said, "Now, go on and walk your path, Dak. Do good things. Make the world a better place." Dak nodded, suddenly knowing, without a doubt, that Sera and Rick had been right all along. He sighed, feeling that too-close-for-comfort feeling. Not for the first time, Abraham Lincoln himself had saved the day. "Goodbye, Dak," the president said. "Bye." It was all he could get through his emotion-choked throat. Dak walked away from his hero, his heart aching, 6 words ringing in his head. 6 words that he'd never forget. Make the world a better place. Chapter 3. The Forest Floor. The sun had set by the time Dak came out of the theater, his shoulders slumped, a suspicious redness to his eyes. Sera wanted to scream at him, pound him, lecture him until the moon crossed the sky, but instead she walked right up and threw her arms around him, squeezing tight. "What happened?" "You were right," he answered. "Both of you. We need to leave before the president gets shot." Sera pulled back in surprise. "You didn't tell him?" "Destiny," was his only response. Sera glanced over at Rick, who shrugged. At least he didn't say, "I told you so," or look smug. The 3 of them had come a long way, leaving behind their childish ways, mostly. "Let's just get out of here," Rick said. "This won't be the best place to hang around in about an hour, and you both know what's waiting for us now." In answer, Sera reached down to her satchel, where the figure-8 shape of the Infinity Ring rested, hard and cold, ready to take them to their final destination, where matters would be settled once and for all. "The prime break," Dak whispered, as if the words were sacred. The 3 of them found an alley and walked into the safety of the darkness. Traveling through the wormholes of time was an experience that Sera would both miss and hope to never do again. She loved it in a way, doing something so scientifically revolutionary, so spectacular, so terrifying, but she also hated it. Every time her body ripped through the dazzling violence of a quantum disturbance, it was as if a part of it got left behind. Time ate away at her like it ate away the years. 19th century Washington, D.C. exploded away from them, replaced by sound and sparks and streaking light and warping pain. Like always, just when Sera thought she couldn't take one more second of it, they were thrown from the wormhole, spilling out and tumbling across the soft leaves of a forest floor near Corinth, Greece. Sera's head whacked the trunk of a tree right at the end of her roll, a perfect ending. Dak must have seen it because he was at her side in a flash. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up at him. "Yeah, fine. Thanks for asking." And she really meant it. Maybe Dak meeting Abraham Lincoln had been worth the extra trip after all. Suddenly he seemed nicer, wiser. Rick was sitting nearby, arms draped across his knees. "When you get back to the future, and everything is hunky-dory and the cataclysm is nothing but a nice remnant, I have a feeling you 2 are going to get married." Dak and Sera looked at each other, eyes widening by the nanosecond. Then they both exploded in a fit of laughter. "Not quite the reaction I expected," the older boy said. Sera got control of herself, but lost it when she made the mistake of meeting eyes with Dak again. After another round of the snickers, they finally stopped. Rick shook his head. "The amount of laughing just now was nowhere near proportional to the humor level. You guys are weird." Dak stood up, then helped Sera do the same, just like a gentleman and his lady. "Rick, you've got a lot to learn about life," Dak said. "Yep," Sera added. His baffled look made him more likable somehow. He stood to join them just as Sera slipped the Infinity Ring back into her satchel. "So what's our mission?" Dak asked, bringing their duties back to the forefront. Suddenly, Sera couldn't bring herself to smile and found it hard to believe she'd been hooting like a tickled 6-year-old seconds earlier. "The prime break," Rick answered. "Plain and simple as that. We need to stop Alexander III from being assassinated. Sorry we couldn't do the same for Abraham Lincoln." Dak looked at him sharply, as if he assumed the boy was mocking him, but the expression quickly softened. Rick had been genuine in respecting Dak's all-out hero worship. "It's a weird mission, you know," Sera said. "What do you mean?" Dak asked. "It's 336 BC, we're in Greece, and we have a mission. But things are so different now. There are no historians here, or SQ for that matter. No time wardens. Aristotle doesn't even know about the society that he created yet. Or, I guess, creates. It's just strange to think about." Dak's eyes lit up like something had just clicked in his brain. If we end up fixing all the breaks, then Aristotle doesn't even need to create the historians, right? So how will our future selves know to come back and... He trailed off, and Sera knew why. "Pointless to talk about," she said. "It's the old go back and kill your own grandma argument. Somehow it just doesn't work that way. Timelines, the river, boulders in the stream, all that. Let's just focus on getting the job done and trusting the historians." "First things first," Rick said. "Dak, you're the history dork." He said the words the same way he'd compliment a nicely cooked steak. "Give us the scoop on what did happen to Alexander, and then we can figure out how to change things." Dak looked like a kid who'd just been given an eternal hall pass at school. "Well, Rick, I'm a little rusty on the subject, but—" "Oh, please," Sera inserted. "You know every little fact and figure. Spill it." "Your wish is my command, my lady." Dak straightened and looked off somewhere in the distance, as if he were recalling an actual memory. "A man named Attalus was behind the murder of King Philip and Alexander. Attalus wanted his grandson, Karanos, to be the next king of Macedonia, and Alexander stood right smack in the way of that. The man who actually did the deed was named Pausanias, a nobleman who'd become a close bodyguard of King Philip. Pausanias poisoned both Philip and Alexander while they were in camp with the army, preparing to march against Asia Minor. Philip wanted to conquer the whole Persian Empire eventually." Sera felt her eyes starting to cross as her friend spoke. All she heard was a bunch of names and the drone of Dak's teaching voice. Even after all she'd experienced, history just wasn't her thing. "It should be pretty simple," Dak continued. "If I remember correctly—" Sera almost groaned at that. Of course he remembered correctly. "Alexander had made a surprise visit to see his dad that day. Alex was actually living with his mom somewhere else. She'd kind of been exiled, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, all we have to do is make sure our boy Alex doesn't make that trip. Then he won't be killed. This might be our easiest break yet." "Don't say that, you goofball," Rick said. "You'll jinx us." Sera sighed, knowing without a doubt that the odds of things being easy were on par with the odds of Dak going on a no-cheese diet. "So when and where does the murder happen?" 3 weeks from now," Dak answered. "Way up near the northern border of Greece, just a few 100 miles NBD. "NBD?" Rick repeated. "No big deal." "Wait a minute," Sera said. "Why are we that early and so far away? Why did the historians have us come to Corinth?" Dak's face split into an all-too-familiar grin. "I think I know exactly why, because there's no way we can do this before talking to the man himself." He paused for a dramatic effect that certainly wasn't needed. "Let's go find Aristotle." Chapter 4. A Doozy. "You know," Sera said, "I spent most of my life thinking I'd never hear the phrase, 'let's go find Aristotle.'" Dak was beaming on the inside, and probably on the outside too. Ever since he'd first learned that Aristotle had been the one to start the historians, he'd been waiting to say those exact words. "Well, it's our lucky day, isn't it?" he said. Then he pulled the square from his pants. He loved keeping it there for the sole reason that Sera made a disgusted face every time she had to touch it. "Now, let's just check in with what our good friend Erin left us on here, if anything. Maybe she knew an exact time and place to find the dude." "The dude?" Sera asked. "That's what we're calling one of the greatest philosophers of all time now? The dude?" Dak was fiddling with the square and barely heard her. After he had logged in, a block of text popped up, with a complicated art of memory pictogram right below it. Of course, Dak thought. Of all the people they'd dealt with, Aristotle would be the one most likely to pass down a cryptic clue concerning the very break that started it all. He was the source of the mnemonic learning system in the first place. Dak showed the screen to his friends. "Oh boy," Rick said. That one looks like a doozy.
Exactly, Dak responded, which is why I'm going to take the first crack at it. Sera reached out and ripped the square from Dak's hands. Silly boys, how about we all do this together? She sat down on the forest floor and held the device out on her lap for all to see. Dak crouched over her shoulder and peered down at the glowing screen. Should I read the poem out loud? Go for it. A tale I'll tell to all the world, a tale not true to them unfurl, to hide the truth, to lead astray those who want the breaks to stay. The murders both are vicious, cruel, an end unworthy for wise nor fool. The one who hides behind the deed is one of evil, spiteful creed. Search the clue to you I give, sift it as sand through a sieve, find the traitor, find the one who'd have our pattern ripped, undone. After Dak read it, he scanned through the words again, hoping that something would pop out at him. But it really just seemed like a prelude to the pictogram below it. That's what they needed to solve. A tale not true. So it wasn't... What was his name? Sera asked, looking over her shoulder at Dak. Attalus, Dak answered. Looks like someone else was behind the murders. Rick was kneeling next to Sera, intently studying the screen. Maybe it'll be obvious once we figure out the clue he left. Looks hard, Dak said, half to himself. Rick nodded. Like I said, a doozy. After several minutes of studying the pictogram, Sera finally clicked off the power to the square. My eyeballs are starting to hurt. Let's take a break and let it simmer in our heads. I recognize the images, Dak said. That's Heracles and Perseus, but they're mythological figures, not historical people. They obviously didn't kill anybody, so what does it mean? I just thought of something, Rick said. Aristotle wrote this clue, right? And Dak thinks the first thing we need to do is meet the old man. So why even bother with trying to solve this? Let's just go ask the source. Dak's first instinct was to take an opportunity to point out just how dumb Rick was, but he didn't have the heart for it. After all, for a split second, Dak had actually thought the same thing. He won't know any more than we do, he said. He won't know anything about the murders or who was behind them until it's already happened. That's the whole point of why we're here? Rick shrugged. Yeah, but still, once we explain who we are, why we're here and all that, we can show him what he created. Call me crazy, but I bet he'd be better at figuring out his own clue than we would be. But, Dak countered, holding up a finger, imagine how impressed he'd be if we solved it first. I think showing up with a time travel device will be plenty impressive, Rick replied. But feel free to tell us the answer anytime you want. Maybe the Greek gods will help you out if you start praying to them. Sera had gotten to her feet, wiping leaves and dirt from her pants. She handed the square to Dak, who slipped it back in his secret pocket. He knew he must look dazed now because the wheels had really started spinning in his mind. Dak, Sera asked, you okay there, buddy? You look like you're going to puke. No, he replied absently. I mean, yes, I'm okay. He shook his head back and forth, as if doing so would put all the pieces into place. Something Rick had said had triggered a disturbing line of thought. Dak? Sera asked again. What's going on? Seriously. He looked at her, then at Rick, then back to her again. I know who did it, he said. I know who the clue reveals, who was behind the murders. That was fast, Rick said. Sera just raised her eyebrows, waiting for the answer. Dak felt sick even saying it. His mom did it. Alexander III's mom arranged to have them killed. Chapter 5 Son of a God. Sera stared at her best friend, having a hard time believing what he'd just said. A soft breeze had picked up in the forest, bringing with it the smells of olives and pine. The day had gotten brighter, too, starting to get a little warm. How did you come up with that? She asked Dak. Plus, what kind of mother arranges for her son to be killed? The look on his face reminded her of a dam about to burst, trying to hold back too much. Not many people know about Alexander's mom. Her name was Olympias, and after a few good years with King Philip, they went their separate ways. Which is a nice way of saying that he fell in love with Cleopatra and gave Olympias the boot. He exiled her. She and the kid were sent off to the countryside. Whoa, 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 Rick said, rubbing his temples. I might not be the historical genius you are, something you like to remind us about 50 times a day, but I know very well that Philip didn't marry the most famous woman in Egyptian history. Dak sighed. Not that Cleopatra. She won't be born for another few centuries. This is a Greek woman, Cleopatra Eurydice. Rick nodded. Oh, yeah. Well, see? Maybe I'm good at history after all. Congrats, Dak muttered, then turned his attention back to Sera, as if she were the only one intelligent enough to continue the conversation. Anyway, so her name is Olympias. What does that name make you think of? Greek gods and such, Sera answered. Exactly, and she only had one son, and he's the son of a king, slightly important to her, so guess what she always called him? Her nickname for him, I guess. Sera pictured the art of memory clue left by Aristotle, and then it clicked. She knew what Heracles and Perseus had in common. A father. You can't be serious. Dak smiled. Oh, I can be serious. She called the kid son of Zeus. Wait, Rick put in. You mean she called him Zeus? No, she called him son of Zeus, as in, hey, son of Zeus, time to get your jammies on, or hey, son of Zeus, it's your turn to do the dishes. Hey, son of Zeus, could you pipe down up there? I'm trying to take a nap, son of Zeus. Rick shook his head. Talk about spoiling your kid. I bet he had a ton of friends at the schoolyard when his mom came by to pick up the son of Zeus every day. Sera had been leaning against a tree, but she straightened and held her hands up in a gesture that said she wasn't quite connecting the dots. The fact she treated him like some mythological hero only makes it more strange that she'd arranged to have him murdered, right? Are we sure about this? I don't know, Rick said. Maybe it has something to do with all that Greek mythology. Those gods were all family, and they were constantly trying to kill one another. We just need to find Aristotle, Dak said, pointing off in a direction as if he knew exactly where they should go. He'll be at the Lake of Corinth, so I'm sure we'll be able to find him with a little snooping around. I got a plaster bust of him for my kindergarten graduation, so I should be able to recognize his face when I see him. Sera tried to hold in the laugh, but it came out anyway, sounding like a burp mixed with a cough. What? Dak said, his expression showing genuine offense. It looked great next to the statue of Michelangelo's David that I got for my preschool graduation. Duh. And with that, Sera started walking in the direction her friend had indicated a few seconds earlier. She didn't care where it led. Dak breathed in the salty air, enjoying the warm breeze as they exited the forest and walked out onto a bluff that overlooked the city of Corinth. He felt a little burst of pride at seeing the grand buildings of classic Greek design, knowing that it was in this very place that one of the best examples of early democratic government had existed. The famous League of Corinth boasted representatives from every city-state in the Macedonian Empire, except Sparta, which had its own agenda. Aristotle had been a key figure in organizing the League, which for many years ceased the infighting of the Greek states and helped lay the foundation for a force strong enough to counter the Persian Empire. That was until their two best hopes at leading were murdered by a man named Pausanias. Dak? Rick said, nudging his shoulder. Looks like you checked out there for a sec, buddy. Dak realized he was staring, almost cross-eyed, at the fresco of famous Greek gods adorning one of the larger buildings, at Zeus himself. Son of Zeus. Could Olympias really have been behind the murders? It seemed crazy. He could barely keep straight all the things swirling in his head. Earth to Dak. Come in, Dak, Sera said, stepping right in front of him. He snapped to his senses. Sorry, it's just amazing sometimes, you know? Looking down on actual history? This brought a pang of sadness. And I still can't bear the thought that everything is changing, getting all jumbled up by what we're doing. I tell myself I'll have the rest of my life to study it, kind of like reading a brand new book with the same characters. I'll just miss the old book. Make sense? Or do I sound like one of Rick's doofuses? No comment, Sera said with a very knowing grin. It makes perfect sense. It does, trust me. We all feel different, weird stuff when it comes to this historian business, but that binds us. We're all weirdos together. And that's the sweetest thing anyone has ever said, Rick added. Come on. Group hug. Dak knew it was weird, awkward, maybe the dumbest thing they'd done yet, but he, Sera, and Rick embraced one another in a tangle of arms and shoulders and squeezed, crushing the breath out of their lungs. A group hug for the ages, right on top of the city of Corinth, Greece. And it felt good. Chapter 6. The Hegemon. The hug had helped Sera feel better. As they picked their way down the sandy bluff, using weeds as handholds, she kept thinking how close they were. They didn't have to do something so grand and amazing as prevent a mutiny or stop an entire war. This mission might be as easy as warning King Philip or Alexander III, making sure they were on their guard. All they had to do was prevent an assassination. Her instinct tried to tell her it couldn't possibly be that easy, but she held on to hope. They reached the bottom of the slope and quickly made their way to the outskirts of the town, where some dwellings had laundry out to dry. It was a trick they'd become very accustomed to, good old-fashioned thievery. We should really be thankful the electric dryer wasn't invented until 1938, Dak whispered, as he pulled on something that looked like a cross between a robe and a toga. He chuckled, that sound that always served as a warning to those who knew him well. His name was J. Ross Moore, bless him. He hailed from North Dakota and had obviously gotten sick of hanging his undies on a wire, his prototype, Dak. Sera eyed him, then gestured at the dwellings, reminding her friend that they were standing on other people's property, stealing their property, and could be spotted at any second. Not the best time. He nodded, not bothering to hide his disappointment. Remind me to tell you later, then. Oh, we will, Rick replied. No doubt. Soon as possible. You see any sandals anywhere? Dak asked, obviously choosing to ignore the older boy's sarcasm. Sneakers will not go over well in 336 BC. Let's just wear what we've got until we find something better, Sera offered. These clothes, she gestured down at the loose flowing material of the robe she'd pulled over her head, should mostly hide them anyway. Man, the way these things drag on the ground, I'd hate to do laundry in this place, dryer or no dryer. Rick huffed. Let's just get out of here before some crazy Greek warrior ninja comes out and chops our heads off with a scimitar. Dak shook his head. I'll pretend like I didn't hear that. It was maybe the most historically inaccurate sentence in history. Come on, follow me. You know where to go? Sera asked. I spotted the statue of the Hegemon from the top of the bluff, Dak answered, already on the move away from the humble dwellings. That's as good a place to start as any. What the heck is a Hegemon, anyway? Sera asked when they reached the main street of Corinth, a bustle of markets and shops and people everywhere. It reminded Rick a bit of Baghdad, except that the architecture was so different, all stone columns and frescoes. Is it some kind of mythical beast? Lots of arms? Dak stopped and turned to look at her. Lots of... What are you talking about? Hegemon is another word for king. Right now it's Philip. He's the hegemon of the League of Corinth. All the city-states of Greece and Macedonia send representatives here to work through their issues. You know, all that political stuff. It's basically a republic, and it keeps them all from fighting one another all the time. Most republics don't have a king, Rick countered. Or a hegemon. Dak shrugged. Well, it was a good start after years of civil war. I won't bore you with any more details. He paused. Unless you want me to. Rick had to restrain the look of horror that wanted to pop on his face. I think you know the answer to that one. Maybe later. Yeah, if you're lucky. Some seriously fascinating stuff. I bet. Rick smiled when Dak turned around and started maneuvering his way through the crowds of Corinth. The kid was a weirdo, but had really become likable. almost to Rick's chagrin. It had been kind of fun when all they did was fight. He looked at Sera, who knowingly winked at him. They turned off of the busier part of the street and entered a square with fountains and pigeons everywhere. Things were a little more relaxed here. People strolling about, lovers whispering into each other's ears, friends eating lunch on stone benches. At the far end of the square, a huge statue of a man on a war horse towered over the people. The man had a laurel crown on his head and a spear in his fist. Beyond the statue was a majestic building with fluted pillars. It was the tallest structure that Rick had seen so far. "The Hegemon," Dak whispered reverently. "And the League of Corinth. This is amazing. If you would have told me when I was 7 years old that I'd be standing here someday." Rick just shook his head. Sera rolled her eyes. "Some reason you three are here?" Rick spun around, startled at hearing plain English in such a place. A person stood there. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, because he or she was swathed in a loose robe with a deep hood pulled so far forward it obscured the face, and the voice had been muffled. "Wait," Dak said, tapping Rick on the arm. "Was that the translator kicking in?" "No," Rick answered, alarm bells ringing inside his mind. "That was perfect English, something that no one from here, from this time, would speak." "Who are you?" Sera asked, attempting, rather poorly, to throw some threat in her voice. The person didn't answer, just stared at them through the darkness within the folds of his or her hood. "Who are you?" Sera repeated. This time, she did a pretty good job of sounding tough. Still, the person said nothing. Then, after a few seconds, the stranger lifted the hood and pulled it back, revealing a man with a bald head. Rick took in a quick breath. Scars covered the man's face, and one of his eyes was deeply bloodshot, as if every vessel had burst and never healed. The guy was about 3 doors down from death. "I'd say I'm a time warden," the stranger said, "but you three know that's not true. There's nobody fitting that description at this point in time. Now, is there?" "But you could be from the future," Dak said. "If we can do it," Sera whacked Dak on the arm, right before Rick did the same. The last thing they needed to do was reveal information to the menacing weirdo. "Ow," Dak responded sarcastically. "For the last time," Sera said. "Who are you? And what do you want with us?" "Who I am is none of your concern," the man growled, as if he were an actor in a bad local theater. He pulled out a long, sharp, gleaming knife. "'Cause you're all about to be dead, and I'd just as soon my name not spill from your lips when you meet the devil." Chapter 7. One Punch. Instead of a rush of fear, Dak only felt impatience. He'd gotten used to bad guys threatening them, and right that second, the only thing in the world he wanted to do was find Aristotle. This bald buffoon standing in front of him threatened to delay that meeting, and Dak wasn't going to let that happen. "Sir," he said, "I know you're holding a knife and all, and we look pretty helpless. At least my companions do anyway, but I'm just going to give you one word of warning. We've been through a lot of junk, and we're the last people on Earth you want to mess with. So stand aside or pay the consequences. Your choice." Sera gave him a look, and Dak wasn't quite sure what it meant. Something between amazement and embarrassment. He figured both applied at the moment. A crowd had gathered around them, and the bald man of scars lowered himself into a crouch, the tip of his blade pointed directly at Dak. "Tough words for a little man," the stranger said, once again in that growl that sounded about as authentic as Rick trying to explain the qualities of a particularly gourmet cheese. "Now, just watch as I—" Dak would never find out what the next word to come out of the man's mouth was going to be. Before he could spit it out, Sera had punched the man in the face, once, hard, a stroke quick as lightning with her fist all balled up like a coiled snake. The man grunted, then stumbled back, flailing to catch his balance. He regained it a split second before running into the lip of the fountain. then fell backward and made an impressive splash in the churning waters. The people in the crowd around them burst into laughter and applause, just as two men in tunics and armor moved in to take the bald menace away. Sera held up her hand, wincing with the pain of the punch. "Let's go find that Aristotle guy," she said. Dak had never been prouder. Rick couldn't wipe the smile off of his own face, and he hoped he didn't look too goofy as he and his friends quickly made their escape from the fountain encounter with the scary-looking man who seemed to come from nowhere. Sera had shown plenty of grit over the course of their adventures, but punching a man twice her size, that quickly and that fiercely, had taken the cake. When they felt as if they were far enough away to avoid any further suspicion or questioning, the three of them stopped to regroup. Rick just looked at Sera in awe, but of course Dak let his thoughts spill out a mile a minute. "That was awesome!" he yelled, dancing back and forth on his feet like a boxer, throwing out fake punches. "I mean, I knew you had it in you and I wasn't surprised at all, but still, so cool! I was about to take care of the poor sap myself, but just as well that you did it." Sera gave him an amused look and simply said, "Thanks." They stood under a tree that was part of a long line bordering the front stairs of what Dak had indicated was the headquarters of the League of Corinth. How someone could know history well enough to figure that out so easily was beyond Rick. But then again, people were baffled beyond measure when they realized he could speak over 24 languages. Even when he showed off a bit, most listeners still didn't believe. They just assumed he was putting them on with gibberish. "How much do we need to worry about that dude?" Dak asked. "You don't think he's SQ, do you? Did Tilda get some of her people back to this time somehow? With her eternity ring?" "Seems pretty darn likely to me," Rick responded. "There's no way that guy was a local, and he said the words Time Warden." "Who knows what Tilda is up to?" Sera murmured. Any look of satisfaction she'd gotten from punching the bald guy's lights out had long since faded into grim worry. "We just have to hope we're one step ahead of them. Aristotle was close to Alexander and his dad, so we have an in that she should never be able to get. Let's just find him and make sure we keep this Pausanias from getting anywhere near his target." "Excellent plan," Dak said. He and Sera both then eyed Rick to see if he approved. "After you," he said with an ornate, sweeping bow, stepping aside so the other two could lead the way. Up the stairs they went. Things were a little different back in the old days. Sera half expected the front entrance to have metal detectors and beefy men and women with guns strapped on their belts to watch for strangers up to no good. Not so, of course. Nothing like it, not even an ancient Greek version. Instead, they found an open, breezy atrium without a soul in sight, save for a man who had to be 100 years old if he was 10. He sat at a wooden desk, staring at the huge front doors, but not seeing anything. He didn't blink or budge a muscle when Sera and the others walked in. Dak started to approach the guy, but Sera quickly reached out and grabbed his arm. "Are you sure we want to bother him?" she asked. "Better to ask for forgiveness than permission sometimes. Let's just go find Aristotle." Dak shook his head. "Your lack of Greek political etiquette is embarrassing. Just give me a sec with the old dude, and we'll save ourselves hours of wandering around like dweebs." "Fine," Sera replied. "Careful," Rick butt in. "He might keel over dead if you get him too excited." Dak gave him an appalled look, then jogged over to the patron for the League of Corinth. Sera and Rick followed. "Excuse me, sir," Dak began. "We're not from around here, but we have some very, and trust me when I say very, I mean very, very important information for Master Aristotle." "Want to throw in a couple more varies?" Rick whispered. "That'll get us in for sure." Sera elbowed him. She was the only one with official permission to give Dak a hard time. The old man at the desk acted as if he hadn't heard a word or seen anyone enter the building. His eyes hadn't so much as twitched. "Sir?" Dak asked. "Can you tell us where to find Aristotle?" Still nothing. They might as well have been talking to a statue. But Sera could see the geezer's chest moving, although his breaths were very shallow and spaced apart. Dak shrugged. "Oh well, at least we tried. So, I guess we just start walking around yelling, 'Aristotle, where are you?'" "That ought to do it," Rick answered. They moved to go around the man and his desk, heading for a set of marble stairs behind him, when the old guy suddenly sprang to his feet, fury animating his face. It seemed like an entirely different person had magically replaced the wrinkled zombie who'd been sitting there seconds earlier.
"Stop!"
the man yelled, his surprisingly deep voice echoing off the high stone ceiling, in ancient Greek.
"None shall enter here who has not sworn the oath. Those not of the League shall suffer the consequences for even attempting such a breach against the Hegemon."
Sera suddenly realized their mistake. The last person they'd spoken to had been speaking English. That meant their translators were only now calibrating to ancient Greek, and that meant Dak had effectively been speaking gibberish to the man who stood between them and Aristotle. A thunder of footsteps sounded from down a hallway to their left. Seconds later, at least a dozen soldiers appeared, spears pointing at the three young newcomers.
"Kill these foreigners!" the old man standing at the desk barked. "Kill them swiftly and without mercy."
The soldiers seemed all too eager to obey, charging forward with a chorus of yells. Chapter 8. Rumble on the Stairs. Dak felt like he'd been thrown into the middle of a practical joke. This couldn't be happening. The League of Corinth was about peace, about philosophy, about negotiation, about bettering the fate of man. And now Dak had some old dude calling him names at the top of his lungs, and a group of manly soldiers charging at him with big, heavy spears, their points looking sharp enough to gut a half-ton pig? It all seemed so out of place that he almost forgot to run. Sera grabbed him by the arm, yanking him back to cold, ugly reality. They sprinted on the heels of Rick toward the stairs that led deeper into the building. As they rounded the wooden desk, Dak glared at the traitorous old geezer, red-faced and puffing his chest, standing at attention, shouting orders that were drowned out by the screaming soldiers. Dak thought those guys must have not seen any action in a while and wanted to make up for it by slicing 3 kids to tiny pieces. How had everything gone so terribly wrong? They hit the stairs and started leaping up them 2 at a time. Sera had yet to let go of Dak's arm, like a mother shepherding her son. He wanted to rip it free. He was perfectly fine to run from bad guys on his own, thank you. But his smarter side said that he might lose his balance doing such a stupid thing. Up they went, the stairs seeming to multiply the more they ascended. There were only 3 from the top when something sharp poked Dak in the shoulder just as a hand gripped him by the ankle. He yelped, and his arm came loose from Sera's grip after all as he stumbled forward, smacking his head on the blunted edge of the very top step. He had a split moment to be thankful that thousands of feet had smoothed the thing out over the years. Then a soldier was on top of him. There was a clatter as the spear the man had held tumbled down the marble stairs. But it was quickly replaced by the nastiest-looking dagger Dak had ever seen, all iron and sharp edges. A few grumbled words of gibberish came out of the dude's mouth before the translator in Dak's ear kicked back into gear. It had taken a nasty hit.
"Out, sliver by sliver!"
Dak didn't want to know the first part. He struggled, squirming to get his body out from under the soldier, who had a knee placed directly in the middle of Dak's chest, pressing him into the hard steps below. "Can't breathe," he sputtered out, hearing the odd echo of the device in his mouth, translating the words for the jerk who held him down.
"Don't care,"
the jerk replied. The dagger pressed against Dak's chin, its pointy tip flicking to draw a droplet of blood. Dak felt it trickle down his neck. Desperation gave him one last burst of adrenaline. He threw his knee up, slamming into the man and making him groan, a sound Dak knew he'd remember with glee the rest of his life if he somehow survived the mess. Off balance on the precarious stairs, the soldier fell back when Dak threw all his strength forward in a final shove. Suddenly free, Dak's elation didn't last more than a half-second. Even before he could get a look around him, he remembered just how many of the armed men there had been and just how big they were. And sure enough, to his dismay, Sera and Rick had been captured by 2 or 3 soldiers each, struggling despite having no chance at all. But Dak refused to give up. Kicking his feet until he finally found purchase on the steps, he vaulted himself forward and ran toward 2 men who had Sera pinned to the ground by her arms and legs. He yelled, screamed was more like it, as if that would give him any more of a chance. At the last second, he leapt into the air, flying for what felt like a full minute. until he crashed shoulder first into the soldier holding Sera's arms. Dak bounced off him like the guy was made of solid stone. He landed hard, feeling as if both his clavicles had broken, trying to focus on the spinning world of marble and stone around him, dread deflating his heart. Then there were soldiers on him, grabbing at his limbs, and Dak reacted on instinct, punching and kicking worthlessly, squirming like a baby who's decided a diaper change is not in the cards. And those few seconds before defeat finally settled in to stay, thoughts flew through Dak's mind. Had history been changed somehow? Was the League of Corinth not what he'd read about in all the books? Had Aristotle gone mad? Evil? Tilda. The guy at the fountain with the scars and the chrome dome. The SQ. Had the SQ come here? Messed everything up? Had it all been for nothing? The spin of questions stopped on a dime when someone punched him in the cheek, sending a swirl of stars around his head, even brighter than the marble on which he lay. All Dak could do was look up at the soldiers and say the first thing that popped into his head. Why are you guys so mean? Chapter 9. Behind Bars Again. Sera sat on a hard floor, with her back against a hard wall, looking at iron bars through the scant light of a window she couldn't see. She was alone, her friends taken somewhere else. It had been a while since she'd had a remnant. She didn't know why, but assumed it was related to the fact they'd been changing the breaks one by one. Whatever the reason, she didn't know if it made her feel better or worse. At least phantom memories of parents she'd never met were memories. During a remnant, she could see her mom and dad, feel them, long for them. And what did she have now? What did you call the memory of a memory? None of it might matter anyway. She and her friends were once again behind bars. She couldn't help but think back to the tiny, dank cell in the lower decks of Christopher Columbus's ship, and things were not quite what Dak had expected at this so-called League of Corinth. She could tell that much just by looking in her friend's eyes as the three of them were dragged away by those less-than-kind soldiers. Less than kind. That was being kind. They'd all been snakes, bordering on bloodthirsty. How could someone as intelligent as Aristotle have anything to do with such a group of bullies? Time ticked on. Sera sat, her rear end getting sore, her muscles stiff all over, a bruise rising on her arm from where one of the men had punched her. A young girl. She thought of cataclysms and wormholes and time paradoxes to keep the boredom at bay. Eventually, her eyelids started to droop, and then finally, sleep snuck in and took her. Sometime later, in the middle of a dream where she and Dak were jumping on a trampoline, and Dak kept yapping about the long and sordid history of metal springs, Sera was awakened by the clank of the door to her cell opening. After she rubbed the blurriness out of her eyes, she saw a soldier standing at the opening, looking slightly abashed. He reminded her of a kid who'd been caught picking his nose. "Come," he said, looking at the floor instead of her. "Our master wants to see you." Odd, Sera thought. But she jumped to her feet, not wanting to lose the chance to get out of the rank little prison. When she reached the soldier, he half turned to leave, but then stopped. After a long pause, he said, "I'm sorry." "You are?" She immediately wished she could take it back, but the words had practically leapt out of her mouth. Why was this big, scary man apologizing? "Just follow me." He headed off down a low-ceilinged tunnel, a perfect setting for a dungeon. Sera followed as they made their way through a few twists and turns and up a long, winding set of stairs. Neither one of them spoke as they walked. Sera breathed a satisfied sigh. It felt good to get the blood pumping and stretch her muscles a bit, not to mention seeing brighter walls and light from outside as they ascended from the depths of the building. Soon, they reached a dark wooden door that led out to a balcony where several chairs faced the railing and the city of Corinth beyond. To the far left, Sera could make out the statue of the Hegemon where they'd met the bald stranger. Dak and Rick were already sitting in a couple of the chairs, and they turned to see her as she walked onto the balcony. Rick waved, and Dak nodded, but neither said anything. "Happy to see you guys are safe and sound, too," she muttered. They both smiled as if they had completely missed her sarcasm. She plopped down in the chair between her two friends, wondering if they'd refused to sit by each other on purpose. "So what in the world is going on?" she asked. Dak shrugged, his face far too giddy for the situation. He'd obviously been scanning the city, relishing every moment of their latest peek into the past. "Seems like someone goofed up," Rick said. "A big burly soldier told me how sorry he was for mistreating us, then brought me here." "Me too," Dak added. "My dude was so sweet about it, we almost ended up hugging." Sera stared out at the twinkle of the sea beyond the city, enjoying the breeze that had just picked up. "It's weird," was all she said in reply. That seemed to sum everything up just fine. Several minutes passed before the person they'd been summoned to see finally arrived. Sera heard movement behind her and turned to see a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a beard walk in, his broad shoulders draped in flowing gray robes that made him look like a wizard. He regarded her gravely, but didn't say anything as he walked around the chairs to stand before them, his back against the railing. Ever since the day they'd met the infamous Amancio brothers and Christopher Columbus, the novelty of meeting people from history had slowly but surely waned for Sera. She knew who stood before her, and she waited patiently for either him to announce it or for Dak to blurt it out himself. In the end, it proved to be very anticlimactic.
"My name is Aristotle," the stately man said. "I understand that you had a little mistreatment from our guards today. Let me be the first to apologize. It's not often we get children around these halls, and I think the soldiers got a little overzealous in dealing with such an unexpected threat. If we could do it over again, they might have treated you in a more genteel manner."
"Genteel manner?" Sera thought. "I guess that's how philosophers talk."
She looked over at Dak, whose earlier expression of glee had melted into a perplexed frown. The poor guy surely hadn't thought his first encounter with the great Aristotle would go like this. "Why did they treat us like a threat at all?" Rick asked. A bruise on his cheek showed he'd gotten more than his fair share of it. "What did they think we were going to do? Bomb the place?" Dak groaned the very instant that Sera guessed he would. Aristotle sighed. He obviously couldn't understand the reference to a bomb, but he didn't ask for clarification. "We've had some troubling events of late, and honestly, I don't feel comfortable speaking about them among strangers. Please don't mistake me. My apologies to you should not be taken as a welcome. I find no reason for you three to be here, and I can't imagine a fitting explanation. But nonetheless, you are young, and the soldiers should have treated you better." "We really need to talk," Dak blurted out. "About history and time travel and the SQ and Great Breaks and Remnants and the Infinity Ring and Tilda and—" "Dak," Sera said sharply, giving him one of the nastiest looks she'd ever had to give. But he'd lost control. Hardly the best way to start the conversation. He's going to kick us out for being lunatics. Rick's head was in his hands, slowly shaking back and forth. Their first meeting with the founder of the Historians was getting more disastrous by the second. Aristotle cast a long, lingering gaze on each of the three strangers. His face said nothing, but his eyes were like pools of knowledge, full of wisdom and deep thoughts. Finally, he took a sharp breath and called for the soldiers at the door. When one of them stepped onto the balcony and asked what was needed, Sera felt a thrilling rush at Aristotle's response. "Bar the door, and let no one through, no matter the cause. I obviously have a lot to talk about with my new friends here."